Hey everybody, Mr. Dustin here, and welcome to Bible class. Today, we're going to be talking about going through difficult things. Now, I want to ask you, have you ever tried to do something that was really difficult, maybe even to the point that you almost were going, I just want to quit, this isn't worth it? Maybe that involves doing something for school, or maybe it involves doing something around the house. I don't know. Maybe it involves trying to tell someone about Jesus and they just wouldn't listen. I wonder if maybe you can talk about that with your family. Take just a minute and talk with your family. What's something that you've tried to do before that was so tough that you almost wanted to quit? Maybe you did wanted to quit, but you persevered anyway. Take a minute and talk about that. So today, we're going to talk about the Apostle Paul. As he was going about his missionary journeys and really through his last journey, making it to Rome, he experienced some very, very difficult things to the point that I would imagine he would almost want to quit. In fact, in one of the Corinthian letters, he actually says, we got to the point where we despaired of life. He was discouraged. But did he quit? No, he didn't. He kept on going. He knew what was coming. In Acts 21, verse 10 and 11, there's a prophet, Agabus. He takes his belt and he binds his own self with it, and he says, this is what the leaders of the Jews will do to the man who owns this belt. They will bind him and hand him over to the Gentiles. Paul knows this, goes to Jerusalem anyway. Whenever he gets there, he eventually gets arrested, and through all these different hardships and trials, he appeals to Caesar. And then he has to go through this kind of a wild journey to get to Rome. But did those things stop Paul from preaching? No, they didn't. He seemed to have this fire burning within him that just caused him to want to continue, even to the point that he would endure a shipwreck. He never seemed to be discouraged. He never seemed to be dismayed. He kept on keeping on. So, what was it about Paul that caused him to be so resilient to these hardships and these difficult trials that he had to go through? I want you to read the secret, I think, to all of these things. It comes from Philippians chapter 4, verse 11 and 12. I want you to take just a minute and read that and say, how did Paul overcome all of these hardships? Philippians 4, verse 11 and 12. See what you think. He says he discovered a secret to being content in all situations. And I often wonder, how did he discover that secret? And I think if we consider back to what we're going to talk about today, Acts 27, this storm that he went through, this sea voyage that he went through, we really find out what that secret was. And I think you look at God's promise to be with him, to keep him safe, and all the things that happened, and he was faithful. And I think for us today, we're living in an unusual situation with this pandemic that is a tough situation. We will be able to look back in spite of all of our difficulties and see God's faithfulness. And I believe that going through those difficulties and seeing God's faithfulness is how Paul discovered the secret to being content in any and all circumstances. When we see God's faithfulness through the toughest seasons of life, we'll realize that he will see us through anything. Now, we're going to do an activity here, so you'll probably need a few things. I've got some rice. I've got a few rocks. Maybe you can use small pebbles. They don't have to be that big. I've got some broken up popsicle sticks or craft sticks. I have some string, or you could use yarn. I've got some grains. You can use kernels of corn or popcorn. And I have a little pirate sword. I'm pretty excited about it. I actually made my pirate sword. So you'll need some of these things, and a big mouth jar or maybe a largemouth bottle, like maybe a Gatorade bottle or a glass bottle or something that you might have that you can use to do this activity. So we're going to use it to kind of walk our way through one of these stories. So grab your supplies real quick, and then we'll keep working. All right, so if you don't have exactly these things, that's okay. Maybe you could use toothpicks instead, or beans, or if you have sand or something like that, or maybe a Lego sword, however you want to go about it. It doesn't have to be exactly these things. We're just going to use them to help remind us of some of the things that are about to happen. Now, if you want to flip over to Acts chapter 27, that's where we're going to be. So the question is, how did Paul get into this situation? Of course, the Jews had accused Paul of causing riots. So they were pretty well beating him. And the Romans stepped in, and they actually arrested Paul, and oddly enough, that ended up protecting him. And so Paul was being accused of starting a new religion, and that was not necessarily approved by the Romans and so forth. So, through a series of trials and interactions with Festus and Felix and Agrippa, all these different leaders of the Roman world, Paul says, I appeal to Caesar. So, to Caesar you have appealed, to Caesar you shall go. So he ends up getting his way to Rome by way of a Roman vessel and being carried off as basically a Roman prisoner. Now, why do you think Paul wanted to appeal to Caesar to decide his case instead of the Jews? Well, I think that there's maybe a few reasons. That the Roman governors, they likely would have just set him free because they didn't see any validity to the charges that the Jews brought, and that could have potentially put him in danger for the Jews. But God had told him, I need you to preach in Rome. So maybe part of it is, I appeal to Caesar, that will get me to Rome so I can go there to preach, maybe. What else is possible? Paul wanted to tell the most powerful leader in the world about Jesus. At the very least, the gospel hadn't reached Rome, and he wanted to go there so he could preach the gospel there. He needed to get there. He needed to go there to preach, and this ended up being his way. So, if you've got all your things, that's great. If not, you can follow along with me, and we're going to work our way through the story from Acts chapter 27, and we will talk about all the things that happened. So, in verse 1 through 12, we just see the beginning of this journey. There's what do they call them? Centurion that is in charge of getting Paul safely to Rome. And he is helping them, just traveling along, working their way there. Nothing really big happens, but the season that they're in is not necessarily favorable for sailing. So the time of year has a lot to do with the weather and the traveling. So this season is not good for that. Nevertheless, in Acts chapter 27, verse 13 through 20, we start to see a storm coming on. It didn't take long for it to become pretty dangerous. Luke tells us in verse 20, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. Everyone on the ship, they feared that they were going to be lost. They were going to lose their lives in a shipwreck at sea. So let's see what happens. We're going to read a little bit here. This is in 27, verse 21 through 26. After they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourselves this damage and loss. But now, I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. Last night, an angel of God, the God to whom I belong and whom I serve, stood beside me and said, Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island. So, running aground, this is where our rice or sand or whatever you have like this is going to come in. So we're going to put this in the jar or the bottle. We're going to have a shipwreck in the bottle. So this is going to represent running aground on some island, right? So that's the sand, the shore of the island that they're supposed to run into. Now, let's keep reading and see what happens. So this is verse 27 through 29. On the 14th day, that's 2 weeks, the 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea. When about midnight, the sailors sensed they were approaching land. They took soundings and found that the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later, they took soundings again and found it was 90 feet deep. Fearing they would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. Okay, so what did they feel like they were going to be dashed against? The rocks, right? And so that's where our rocks come in handy. So we're going to put these in there to remind us they had to run aground. That's the rice, the sand, if you will. And they were going to be dashed on the rocks. So they dropped down their 4 anchors. Now, we'll keep going. This is in verse 30 through 32. In an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboat down into the sea, pretending they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. Then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved." So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it drift away. So for this one, we're going to put in our string. This is to represent the ropes that were cut that were holding the lifeboats. And then we have our sword. This represents the soldiers who did the cutting of the ropes that were on the boat as well. So we're going to drop our sword in there as well. So then we'll keep going. This is 33 through 38. Just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. "For the last 14 days," he said, "you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now, I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head." After he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves, although altogether there were 276 of us on board. That's a lot of people. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. So then we're going to take our grains, we're going to throw them into the sea. So they had to run aground, they're going to be dashed on the rocks, they cut the lifeboat ropes and let them go, and then we have the soldiers with the sword, right? And now they've thrown their grain into the sea. So that's kind of what we're doing so far. Let's keep reading. This is verse 39 through 44. The soldiers planned, I skipped a bit. 39, not 42. Verse 39, when daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. Remember, the sand, they got to run aground. Cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea, and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach. But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow stuck fast and would not move, and the stern was being broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. But the centurion wanted to save Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and swim to land. The rest were to get there on planks or on other pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land safely. And that's where our broken popsicle sticks come in. These represent the broken pieces of the ship that people had to float ashore on. So this is our shipwreck in a bottle. So whether you keep this visible somewhere where you can see it and you can remember they had to run the ship aground, they were going to be busted up on the rocks, then they threw the grain overboard and they cut loose the lifeboats and the soldiers and everything. However you want to do that, this is a good project that you can use to remember that story. To remember, even through this shipwreck, very difficult, very trying experience, God was faithful. He said, you're going to get there. Nobody's going to lose life. He promised Paul. And so Paul trusted God. And sure enough, even in spite of the storm and all the crazy things, God was faithful. And I think that helps Paul remember, even through those difficult times, God will sustain us. And that is where he finds the secret to being content through all circumstances, in good and bad, plenty and in want, all those things. So, this season of life when we're going through right now, where it's really tough, God will see us through. And when we get on the other side, it will be something we look back on and we see God's faithfulness, even in the storm. So thank you for coming to Bible class today. I hope you had fun making your shipwreck in a bottle, and I will look forward to seeing you again on Wednesday. Have a good week.